Take some on the way out because we need it, as you can see. Second part, we've got two speakers here, and then Alistair will make some brief comments right at the end. So we have Sarah Camby, but first of all, Emma Hill. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm beginning to lose my voice, so I'm really hoping it lasts for this presentation and I don't do a bit of a Theresa May, so my apologies if I do. So I'm probably a new face for most of you in this room. If I am, my name's Emma. I've just started recently in the Department of Sociology. I'm working with NASA on the Glimmer project. Before that, I was a PhD student at Heriot-Watt University, where I gained my PhD in cultural studies, and my doctoral research worked on the topics that I'm going to discuss today. So my PhD research was interested in ideas of in the way in which Somali people felt they either did or did not have voice in Glasgow, what that meant, and kind of unpacking the social and cultural things that contributed to those feelings. So my research is primarily ethnographic. It tried to take a decolonizing participatory approach, and it did so within the context of the Adan studies movement, which looks at ideas of whiteness in Somali studies scholarship. So in that sense, this research can be considered problematic. If anyone would like to discuss that, I'm very happy to, but I'd like to kind of move on to the content of the presentation. We can discuss that afterwards. So in this presentation today, I want to do two things primarily. I'd like to begin a discussion about the relationship between Scotland and Somali people and consider what the relationship implies for discussions about belonging and citizenship in Scotland today. And then secondly, I'd like to ground this discussion in Somali people's experiences of public space in Glasgow and consider how exclusions from public space, and especially exclusions that are racialised and racist, expose limits of civic citizenship that arise in everyday encounters. I intend to do this primarily through a consideration of Glasgow's public space as white spaces. So I'm going to briefly go over this to begin with, and then I'll kind of get into Somali people's experiences of it as I progress. So we might think about whiteness in terms of the processes through which white identities are racialized, and in the context of this paper, positioned as dominant. Whiteness, Sarah Ahmed observes, is invisible. It goes unseen and unremarked, a normative position that carries considerable privilege. Here we might also think about whiteness as a process of domination that identifies identities not racialized as white as outside the norm, that marks them out of space and seeks to subordinate and exclude. There is some work that might be understood as uncovering a long history of whiteness in the material spaces of Glasgow City. So I'm here thinking of scholarship that looks at the links between Glasgow's Victorian architecture and its role in empire building. However, I think whiteness must also be considered in Glasgow settings today. By this, I mean that we need to think about how whiteness works in contemporary material spaces but we also need to think about how ways in which space might not just be about materiality and what this means. Sarah Ahmed suggests that space is not something that is neutral or fixed. Rather, she suggests it's something that becomes associated with particular repeated ways of being over time, so that social habits form social habitats. In settings where whiteness remains normative, whiteness therefore becomes the dominant shaper and organizer of space in its multiple categories. So, what has this to do with Somali experiences in Glasgow? I'm going to contextualize a kind of Somali relationship with Scotland first, and then I'll move on to specific experiences. So the Somali population in Glasgow today largely has roots in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Somali people were brought to Scotland initially under the dispersal scheme, and they were one of the largest populations initially brought to Glasgow because the scheme coincided with a spike in violence in the Somali conflict. So when the scheme started, Somali people were one of the largest asylum-seeking populations. They've since settled over the last 15, 20 years. Many have gained citizenship, many have also built communities and established their lives here. So as a result, there's been a significant increase in the population. In 2001, Glasgow City Council found 159 Somali people in Glasgow. The 2011 census found 1,591, and ONS estimates put a top-end estimate at 4,000 in Glasgow, although I would suggest from my research there's probably a few more. Incidentally, this is not the only relationship between Scotland and Somalia. So in my research, I found links between Somali people and Scotland that go back to the early 1900s. If anyone here knows of any earlier links, I'd be really interested to hear them. So just a few examples that I can't go into detail here, but again, happy to discuss if anyone's interested. So in 1910, Somali people were brought to Edinburgh to participate in the Somali village, a euphemism for a human zoo. In the early 1900s, there were Somali sailors who came to and settled in Glasgow, and then were subject to kind of racially discriminative legislation of that era. There's other links, but more recently, in 1989, the murder of Ahmed Abubakar in Edinburgh kind of made headlines and was a precursor to the way in which the Stephen Lawrence case was handled. So these links between Somali people and Scotland are grounded in a history of colonial violence and of racial violence. However, these histories are not ones that have hardly been traced, even with the emergence of a significant and established Somali population in Scotland. A lack of public awareness of the relationship between Somali people and Scotland also extends to the contemporary community. When I started this research, there was what can only be described as a complete absence of information about Somali people in Scotland that extended to population data, as well as kind of more general discourses on Somali people in Scotland. In the few discourses and narratives that did mention Somali people, limits on categories of belonging and citizenship quickly emerged. So Somali people were closely associated with asylum seeking, and asylum seeking was closely related to Somali people, blackness, Africanness, and a very kind of limited form of belonging in Scotland. You can see this very nuanced headline from the Daily Record here, tries to portray the only way it can imagine that Somali people might fit within certain parts of Glasgow. So what I want to consider now is some of the kind of experiences of the people with whom I worked and what they tell us about about how white space and whiteness works in Glasgow, how this might connect to broader narratives. So the first kind of emphasis from participants' experiences and observation of racism in Glasgow was that it was ubiquitous. Everybody that I spoke to had experienced racist abuse. It was part of the norm. and across age, gender, and how long they had lived in Glasgow. So the first point would be that a lot of the racist abuse that people encountered sought to kind of very physically remove people from the material spaces of Glasgow City. If we take, for instance, 16-year-old Ifra's experience, who says, "I had an incident yesterday, actually. I was going to school, and he moved out, and I walked to the side, and he came and basically pushed me to the side for no apparent reason, and I nearly fell as well. But I said nothing because he was a guy, and I was too scared." So Ifra's experience is racialized, it's also gendered, and has anti-Muslim categories as well. But in this experience, whiteness works on a visual economy that identifies visual categories. So Ifra's skin color, her gender, her headscarf, racializes them and considers them as out of place. And the way it reacts to that is that it literally seeks to remove her from the physical path of the man who abused her. The second thing that Somali people's experiences emphasized was how whiteness works through surveillance and seeks to control people's activities in public spaces in Glasgow. So whiteness had a habit of marking people as out of space, making people feel hypervisible, and making them constantly feel as if their presence in public spaces was not normative. So this occurred in libraries, in health centres, at protests, in political debates, public transport, just when people were walking to work or walking home, it occurred everywhere. Thirdly, people's experiences emphasised that it wasn't just material space that people were being removed from or surveilled in. It was also other forms of space, so communicative space, for instance. So in this example, Abdurrahman is part of a friendship group who likes to come together at the weekend with other men his age, stand on a street corner and have a chat together. But in his experience, this isn't really okay in Glasgow, because as soon as they start to do that, people start to notice them, to mark them out, and try and remove them from the space. So he comments, "Our voices are very loud, and that is making people look. Because, as you know, Scottish people like a gab, but then they say, oh, 4 or 5 black guys on the road, because, you know, there's what we call a perception of 4 black guys standing over there. So they go get them off the road, and sometimes they phone the police, and the police come, and you get problems with the police." So in this experience, whiteness extends beyond kind of trying to physically remove, but also control in a communicative sense as well. So I've given 3 examples here. I'm going to try and pull them together. In the experiences recounted here, whiteness places restrictions on Somali experiences of public spaces by attempting to physically remove them from the material space of the city, by surveilling and curtailing their activity, and by encroaching on multiple categories of space. It is notable that all the spaces in which whiteness seeks to restrict Somali activities are spaces in which Somali people might otherwise participate in activities related to civic citizenship. So spaces of protest and debate, spaces of community and connection, and spaces of political or transnational engagement. In many cases, Somali people choose to limit their participation in these public activities and instead maintain them only within the Glasgow Somali networks. Though many continue to engage with matters of civic citizenship, the absence of Somali people from public spaces has often led to local charges of the population being isolated and insular, even as the white spaces of Glasgow City seek to isolate them further. Meanwhile, should Somali people choose to participate in public activities, they do so in the knowledge that their actions will be marked and surveilled. Moreover, the way in which this marking out occurs places further limits on their access to belonging in Scotland. So So, whiteness is increasingly recognised as plural in Scotland, but this is not a logic that is extended to Somali people. As the experiences within this talk demonstrate, whiteness is an ethnic option denied to Somali people in Scotland. However, Somaliness is also an ethnic option denied to Somali people in Scotland. Somalis might identify with multiple categories, such as brown-skinned, Arab, and Black African, and Muslim. However, for Somalis in Glasgow, incorporation in public spaces works through a near-constant process of misrecognition that fails to acknowledge these complexities. So, for instance, in public spaces in Glasgow, Somali people would be recognised either as brown-skinned, as Asian, and as Muslim, or as Black African. The two identities never crossed over, and frequently one was recognised over the other. So the way in which people were recognised were racially discriminative and often violent. They also failed to acknowledge the plurality of Somali ethnic options. Under their terms, Somali people could either be Asian and Muslim or African, but not both. These terms were rarely informed and rarely mobilized accurate categories. As a result, Somali people often experienced public spaces in Glasgow in terms of being seen, but not really being seen, whilst the exclusions and restrictions that they encountered were based on an economy of false recognition. Should a Somali person choose to participate in civic activities in Glasgow's public spaces, they did so in anticipation that their participation will likely be marked, misrecognised, flattened, and partial. So this is, and again, a comment from Ifra. So how to conclude these observations and kind of more general narratives about Somali people in Scotland? I'd like first, I think, to focus on Somali experiences. So Somali people's experiences of public spaces in Glasgow City emphasise that processes of racialisation and exclusion are ubiquitous. They're directly linked to limitations on civic participation, and they also play into the dominant narratives that Somali people still encounter in Scotland, that Somali people are somehow not quite citizen, they're racially limited, they are considered asylum seekers and migrants and not quite belonging. These broader narratives about Somalis who still as a refugee community obscure long-established processes of racial discrimination that can be seen in Scotland's historic relationship with Somali people that I briefly went over at the beginning of this presentation. So these things, I think, need further dialogue. They need visibility and people unpacking and untracing and discussing them further, which brings me on to my second point. So my second point would be to advocate a more nuanced way of thinking about race and belonging in Scotland. So Somali people's experiences highlight how both nuance and complexity are missing from current understandings of identities excluded from whiteness. They also highlight the continued dominance in whiteness in formulations of belonging in Scotland. In a context where an ostensibly inclusive civic belonging is celebrated by political, academic, and public elites, more consideration might be given to how our continued investment in white norms participate in long-established processes of racialization and exclusion. So that's me. Thank you.
We shift the final paper of the day is Sarah, who's going to shift from the specifics, I suppose, of Glasgow to a more broader look at Scotland's migration options more globally. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Right. Should I be wearing this? Yes? No?
Only if the room can't hear you.
Okay, might make it easier on me actually. Okay, well, I'm Sarah Camby, and I work as a consultant on immigration policy That's my area of expertise. So I work for a whole number of think tanks. Sometimes I work affiliated to the university. Recently, I've been working a lot on the potential impact of Brexit on immigration to Scotland, and I guess I'll be doing that for quite some time to come yet, but not long enough. Right, the overview of what I'd like to talk about today. So I'm covering Scotland's migration policy in a global context. And to do that, I thought I would provide a little bit of context first on the immigration system and data. I'd have a look at some of the drivers of migration policy in Scotland. And we'll have a short look at Brexit, because Brexit infects all that I do these days. So, current migration. So immigration is a reserved power. That means that power resides at Westminster. And current UK policy, I would say, is just completely dominated by the migration target of a net migration figure in the hundreds of thousands. So we've currently managed to bring it down to 230,000. That was last month's stats, down by almost just over 100,000 on the previous year. And I mean, this target has been around since, I think, 2010, meaning that twice a year we ritually get to speak to Home Secretaries on the news as to why this target cannot be met. But if we look at immigration generally, one tends to distinguish by reason for migrating. So we look at labour, students, people come for family migrations. Other tends to include things like humanitarian migration, resettlement of refugees. And they're basically, I mean, that's kind of the order in which they're in at the moment, which is that labour migration is the largest group, followed by students and family. It used to be the other way around with labour and students. But labour migration has been one of the key policy foci, and that's one of the things I'm going to focus on today. In terms of region of origin, again, we've seen a huge diversification in the countries of origin. But I think the migration target has had this result in shifting the balance between non-EU and EU migration in terms of the proportions, simply because EU migration was one tap that couldn't be turned off. So we are seeing an increasingly restrictive policy, so with ceilings and thresholds on things like access to permanent citizenship, access to various kinds of social rights, an increasingly pervasive enforcement policy, which is now termed a hostile environment. So this is where we recruit, whether it's employers, benefits agencies, we recruit other parts of the state and non-state actors in enforcing immigration policy, including now things like landlords, banks, although you won't have seen that in Scotland yet. So when we talk about migration target, talking very briefly about what goes in and out of that. The migration target, net migration, is immigration minus emigration. So if it's positive, you've got more people coming in than leaving. But there are different components to this. And it's one of the reasons why the migration target, you know, it shifts in different ways, but for different reasons. And what you can see there is, so the blue line, this sort of teal line, terrible graph, sorry, is British migration. EU is the yellow line, and at the top there is non-EU. And often the shifts can happen because maybe there's more people leaving. So there's an increase in emigration. Shifts can happen because there's more of certain other groups coming back in. And it's just basically actually a very complicated picture, and that's worth knowing. And so when we look at net migration by citizenship, what we see is, the first column is 2002, the last one is 2014. And what you see there is that while net non-EU migration stays more or less the same, the blue column is the increase in immigration from the EU over that period, net migration from the EU. So again, I think that's quite relevant in terms of understanding where immigration is coming from to the UK, and that more of it is coming from the EU. I make the same point here. The blue slice is the EU 27. That goes up from about 40 to 60% of the migrant stock population over that period. Yellow stays more or less the same. That's migrants coming from Asia. It's around about 20%. The orange slice is migrants coming from Africa. That decreases by about 5 percentage points there. So that kind of gives you a bit of context as to who's coming in and who's going out and what's changing in very, very broad terms. But what I now want to talk about is what are some of the drivers in Scotland, rather than just looking at the UK data. And I think what we are starting to see is a divergence in the policy goals for immigration between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And there's 3 reasons for this. There's population, labour force, and politics. And I'm trying to take each of those in turn. So when it comes to population change, and what you see is that Scotland's population is ageing more rapidly than that of the UK as a whole. And you can see that in those figures there. It's also that projected population growth in Scotland, the most recent projections have 100% of Scottish population growth is going to come from immigration, of which 58% is overseas migration. So immigration plays a far larger role in Scotland's plans for its population than it does for the UK as a whole. And I think we were talking earlier about differences not only between Scotland and the rest of the UK, but also differences between Scotland and elsewhere. And what we're seeing is a policy emerging in Scotland that's in part driven by population goals, and that's quite an unusual thing. It's not unusual in the sense that ageing and declining populations they're a concern across most OECD countries. But what is unusual is that it's becoming an increasing driver of one of the things that we may seek to do with immigration. So in 2001, so I mean it's already quite a long time ago, that the UN actually had a study commissioned where it looked in depth as to whether replacement migration could be a solution for I think almost all but 2 of OECD countries at that time had aging or declining populations. And for the UK, the answer they came up with was that migration provides a solution to population decline. At that time, Scotland, at least, had a declining population, so the population was getting smaller. But that it wasn't a solution to population aging. Partly that is because migrants also age. And also migrants' birth rates tend over time to kind of become the same as the birth rates of the native population. Although, within that, I think I would add another caveat, is that immigration can help offset some of the effects of population aging, which is that it can help you offset the declining support ratios that you're seeing in your economy. The reason why population is difficult is that if you have an aging population or a declining population, you have less people in work for more people who cannot work. And you need to work out how you're going to make that practicable in any economy. So when we come on to labour force issues, and I've actually called this labour force instead of labour needs because I am starting to think we need new language for this. There's been a lot of debate recently as to whether there are differences in Scottish labour force. Well, they keep saying labour shortages in Scotland. Are they different to the UK as a whole? And I have to admit that the data on vacancy rates is very similar. The problem is that Scotland being that much smaller, there is very little data we can get our hands on in terms of top-down data. And there's a whole number of other problems that are being investigated. So one is, so the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the body that advises on whether certain occupations should be put on the shortage list. The shortage list is one of the key lists in which you can recruit labour migration under the points-based system. And there is an additional sort of category for Scotland where there's a Scotland-specific shortage list. So that recognised that Scotland might have different labour needs. But this shortage list has been around for about a decade now, and it's not been very much used, I would say. But it's difficult to understand why it has not been used so much. And to some degree, I think there is a problem with the method, which is that the Migration Advisory Committee has determined the shortage occupation lists, looking at, is it skilled? Is it a skilled occupation? Is it a shortage occupation? And is it an occupation that is, are these jobs that it is sensible to fill with immigration? Now, all of those three are actually judgment calls. But the most difficult one is the idea of what is sensible, because that understanding of what is sensible is underpinned very much by a Westminster and Whitehall understanding of immigration needing to be very severely restricted. And so therefore what's sensible becomes quite narrow. Now there are people in this room who can talk a lot more about that, such as Lorraine from COSLA, about how difficult it's been to try to expand that out and to get what Scottish employers see as shortages recognised within this system. And there is a new consultation going on at the moment in terms of EEA workers. And again, we have problems about this methodology and how to get it to work. And there are other issues. So the next issue is also that there are probably more small to medium-sized enterprises in the Scottish economy. And that makes a difference. The difference that it makes is that if you are a large employer, the kinds of data that you can collect that are seen as persuasive by the Migration Advisory Committee are just easier to get your hands on. So for instance, if you contrast the care sector, in England you've got a couple of very large employers in that sector. They can bring together data, they can fill in that data. In Scotland, it's different. A lot of these people are small organisations that have labour shortages, but they can't bring together the kind of data that sort of passes those sort of thresholds for looking persuasive as to the MAC as a real labour market shortage, as opposed to, well, here's an employer who doesn't want to pay more than £7.50 an hour. And again, with sectoral differences, again, we see differences in uptake. Under the previous seasonal agricultural workers scheme, we know that Scotland took 14% of workers under that scheme, so far more than population-wise would be proportionate. So again, I think we see variations here that indicate to us that the system that we have at the moment possibly doesn't work as well as it should. Similarly, with pay thresholds, the Migration Advisory Committee determined several years ago not to vary pay thresholds. Again, it's easy to see how that then privileges people who want to go and work in London and the South East, where wages are higher. So just to demonstrate this a little bit further, this is a graphic from the most recent Migration Advisory Committee briefing paper. This is really looking at the question of EEA workers post-Brexit. And where this is interesting is when you think of so if Tier 2, so these are skilled occupations, so if you put in a Tier 2 threshold, the Tier 2 threshold is 30,000. That's what you have to earn to get in as a labour migrant under this. And when we look at what EEA-born workers are earning by skill level, you'll see 90% of them are out as low-skilled workers. They fall below the threshold. Around about 75% of the medium-skilled fall below that threshold. And about, 35% of the highly skilled. So, I mean, I know that kind of bleeds into Brexit, but if we imagine, okay, so if we just took the current system that we had for third country nationals, so those who are outside the European Union, and use that for people who, for our immigration system post-Brexit, then there's an awful lot of people that you can no longer bring in to work. I mean, for that reason, I think it's unlikely that we can simply move it across like that, but you can see the scale of the problem. Now, I'm going to go on to politics, and for part of politics, I want to talk about public attitudes, but NASA has dealt with these, and I'm kind of glad that he has, because attitudinal data is not my thing. But I mean, we often talk that there is a more positive attitudes to immigration in Scotland, and I think the only point I wanted to make in relation to that is they are more positive. They are a long way from being positive, however. Even though I think, you know, again with this graph, as Nasa said, there's more scope for nuanced understanding there. But I'll move on to political support. So we are starting to see fairly wide-ranging support politically for the view that Scotland needs more immigration, not less. So in part, we are seeing, and we have seen this for some time, is more generous policies that affect migrants in Scotland. So for instance, some of the hostile environment policies are not being implemented in Scotland. So requirements that landlords check the immigration status of their tenants, that's not going to be happening here. Some of the things around banking are not happening here. The regulations in place for restricting access to healthcare, I don't know if they're not going to happen or if they've just been delayed. And again, we've seen far more generous policies on refugee integration and more recently on refugee resettlement. With Scotland, I think there was data out a week or two ago where Scotland has taken 20% of UK refugee resettlements, which is really actually a really stunning achievement. And so out of this situation comes an increasing support for either devolving aspects of immigration policy or for an increasing differentiation of immigration policy. And I'll briefly go into what that means. So in terms of having a more differentiated immigration policy, I think what we need to discuss is, hang on a minute. I think there's two things, and I'll wrap it up in this slide. Some of these concerns are coming about because of the pressures of Brexit, and for instance, an increased concern both in terms of population and labour force needs about the need for low-skilled immigrants or immigrants generally, a more generous approach to family rights coming out of the Scottish Government than you're seeing down at Westminster, despite last week's kind of agreement on family rights. I think that's the position on family rights is really interesting in relation to race and ethnicity. So we have been seeing an increasing restrictiveness on access to family rights for UK nationals and for third country nationals. So there are income thresholds for bringing your family in. So I think you need to earn £18,500 in order to live with your spouse. For every kid, on top of that, you can add another £2,000. That gets expensive. Gets expensive very quickly, and there are people in this country who live without their immediate family because they can't afford it. You can't do that to EEA nationals because we have rights guaranteed by the European Court of Justice. And this has been one of the key measures, one of the key points of tension in the Brexit negotiations. Now, I think what's interesting there is if you continue to have this differential, either one will need to go down, i.e. EEA nationals living in the UK will need to see their family rights be eroded, or, and I think this would be a really good thing to fight for, is to try to get family rights of everybody else brought up. And I think this will disproportionately affect BME groups, particularly BME groups who tend to marry co-nationals from their country of origin. If they're immigrants. So I think there's a real there's a set of issues there that that have been hot for quite a while, but will be getting hotter. And in a way, there's two ways of solving them. The same with access to settlement. I think one of the things, the big differences you're starting to see with Brexit is that post-Brexit and post-free movement, where you had a fairly fluid transition from immigration to settlement, that the UK, and this is not unusual in the UK will be leaning towards temporary or circular migration systems. And yet for Scotland, particularly in terms of its population needs, the emphasis will be much more like actually getting people to stay would be a bonus. Temporary migration can help you in terms of your support ratios in the economy, but possibly, particularly with rural depopulation and just population decline as a whole, permanent settlement is actually has got things that are very attractive for Scotland in a way that they are not attractive for England. If you compare the population densities per square kilometre, Scotland's got population density of 60, England's got one of 400. There are differences here that are driving differences in policy in interesting ways. In terms of a regionally differentiated immigration system, this seems to be an idea whose time has come. There have been, I think, 5 reports in the last 12 months on this issue. I wrote a report on this in 2009 and nobody covered it, but I was first. So this seems to be going around. There seems to be, it's finding its way into official policy documents. The MAC consultation talks about considering regional differences. But there are limitations in how that will be considered and whether the argument that regional differences inside the different UK constituent nations are actually, they're just as big as the differences in between, and what that will mean in terms of how you differentiate. I think it's fair to say, I mean, I've done some work on this earlier this year with Professor Boswell at Edinburgh University and Saskia Smelly, and we were looking at ways in which you differentiate and which types of migration systems are best suited to what types of purpose. So, for instance, human capital systems are very good for selecting populations for permanent settlement, employer needs-driven systems. So different systems have got their challenges and their weaknesses, and there are problems with... it's difficult to work out how that works within the UK, current UK immigration system. But I think we did see avenues for enforceability and ways of making this feasible that I'm very happy to talk about at greater length. But I'll leave that there for now.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, I thought NASA was going to be on mic duty, but oh, you are, okay. But you need someone under the age of 40 to turn it on. Fantastic, right? Okay, and I'll invite the lady at the front. Do you want to ask? Yes, absolutely. So, lady at the front, we didn't get. Tell us who you are.
My name is Safi Ali. I work for Central Scotland. I'm a risk equality mainstream officer. My question goes back to the previous talk that we had as well. I just wanted to reflect on the fact that nationalism, when we always come back to the word nationalism, it is actually related to being white. And that's the problem we have. We have nearly 4th generation of especially Asian community living here. Children are still questioned at school, where do they come from? So, I mean, we have this issue that the education system in this country is failing the children. So we need to look at the education system, we need to look at why race and ethnicity and where we come from in many ways, especially Brexit. Brexit brought out a lot, and also the terrorist attacks brings out a lot. Because every time anything of that happens, children are questioned, children are told to go back, and there's been lots of issues. I live in the Central region, so we had the council up and we had lots of talks with the community because there were a few racist attacks, especially on women. It's usually the most vulnerable that will be attacked, that we women. There was an incident on the train, and etc., etc. So the council, the police, everybody, we had a big conference, it was a pretty big meeting in Central region where I have lived, my family have lived for over 30 years. First time we actually seen half of the people, so it's quite good. But the fact is they'd all come together because they're all, first of all, very concerned. But if you talk to the younger generation, they will associate themselves as being Scottish, first and foremost Scottish. Then they will have their religion, then they will have anything else. And you can do that. And I mean, I've studied and I've also worked with ethnic minority communities for good over 20 years, and that's predominantly in Glasgow, and in Central Region, and that's what they'll come up with. My concern is until we have a more diverse society that reflects ethnic minorities, we will always have these issues of belonging and nationality. And I'm talking about diversiveness within the work sector, within the workforce, within right at the top in the Scottish Executive. I mean, I work with the Scottish Executive, and I will go and I will ask them, where is your recruitment? And we work with public sector and private sector, and we'll ask them, look at your recruitments, look at your procurements, look at where and how you are recruiting, and where's your diversity. Until we promote more diversity and we have role models, we will not really, we'll be talking about this in 10 years' time again. And again and again, because we have this issue of the belonging has to reflect the society, and until you have people that reflect the society of, like we were talking about migrants, majority of migrants have got about 3 degrees, especially Syrian refugees, they have such education.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Can you ask the question?
Yeah, well the question was my question was until, can you see that nationalism is divided on race? Because the problem that we have is we don't really like to talk about race in Scotland, and we have to see that when we talk about nationalism we have to be very clear it is about white and black I mean politically, so all non-white. So that's my question out there.
Okay. You guys want to take that? I mean, the role of education might be interesting for your Somalian.
Okay, so firstly I would say absolutely, I agree with you, and that's kind of the point that I've been trying to make in my presentation. I'm not sure if you noticed, I didn't actually use the word nationalism once because I really wanted to focus on these processes of whiteness and how they contributed to ideas about belonging and citizenship. So yeah, I'm with you on that. In terms of kind of belonging in first, second, third generation belongings, from my research, to be honest, I think across generations, Somali people still found it very difficult to identify exclusively as Scottish. Most people would identify as British Somali, but primarily as Somali because, and then this links to whiteness, because of the levels of racism that they had experienced. So yes, essentially to answer your question.
I guess I could. I don't think I can answer the question. I could comment a little bit, not on nationalism, but I think what's very interesting, and that maybe it emerges more when you compare it, is that the UK as an immigration system has gone for an increasingly stratified system. So what you do is you divide up groups by their immigration status, and you give different groups different rights, and then you have to spend an awful lot of time surveilling and enforcing this, creating a kind of surveillance state culture. And I mean, and what we know from the attitudinal data and attitudinal research is that when people talk about these things, they don't just make nice distinctions between immigration, asylum seeker, ethnic minority. It just all kind of gets lumped together. So in fact, what you do then is that this surveillance state will disproportionately look at the people that it thinks, oh, you must be a person of interest, you know, from various personal characteristics that you've got. What that has to do with immigration status is not, you know, I mean, a lot of the time I was involved in the attitudes to asylum research at IPPR back in 2004, 2005, focus groups across the country. And I think one of the biggest problems we ever had is, they're just talking about, they're talking about, essentially they're talking about the black family down the road, you know, that's who they're talking about. They're not talking about asylum seekers. And that we found it very difficult to unpick any of those attitudes to asylum seekers per se. So I think the two issues spill over into each other, and I was really interested in Charles's talk about actually making those two areas of focus overlap a little bit more than we have been, certainly in the last 10 years.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Lady there. Tell us who you are first.
Hi, I'm Anne Perez. I'm from the University of California, Davis. And Dr. Hill, I wanted to ask you a question in particular, although I really want to thank you both for your presentations. I was wondering if you could say more about that differentiation of identity between what you were saying about Somalis are restricted from even fully identifying as Somali, that they could either be Muslim or they could be Black, African, and, or then there were some other categories as well. what are some of the manifestations of that restriction? Like, is it a bureaucratic or a formal thing, or something? I was just hoping you could say more about that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll try and say a wee bit more. So Somalis themselves, again, it would vary from person to person, so I don't want to talk in broad sweeping terms, but so people would identify with multiple categories. They would identify as Arab, as Muslim, as Black African. Sometimes all of those things at once, sometimes one, according to which situation they were in. However, what they found in public life is that because largely they were brown-skinned, and particularly women who wore headscarves were then associated with Asian ethnicities, because I guess that's what the Scottish public are most familiar with in terms of Muslim populations. So they constantly found that for them it was just a process of misidentification, of people not knowing their history, of people not knowing that they were there. So if people were speaking, if a Somali person was speaking at a public event, they would either really need to contextualize themselves and kind of explain themselves and start from that point instead of making the points that they wanted to make. And it's that kind of constant process of explanation and trying to get people to recognize them that then prevents participation in kind of the actual things that they want to do. Does that answer your question a bit more?
Yeah, so it came out in the discussions that you had.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lady at the back.
Hi, Eve from the University of Aberdeen. I had a question about when we talk about migration policy, I don't know how we can talk about that without kind of linking that to the practical experiences of migrants, and indeed talking about bureaucracy and the immigration system itself and how it deals with people. And in the face of Brexit, I mean, we really are, for people who've had, you know, first-hand experience of the immigration system in the UK, we're really facing a complete minefield, basically, because we don't have the bureaucratic capacity to cope with the demand of the amount of European citizens now who are applying for British citizenship, for example. We certainly don't have the capacity to deal with people outside the EU as well. So that was just my question, really, is how do you foresee that? Because in policy, you know, you can have as much policy as you want to talk about integrating people and having a system that welcomes them, but when the system itself is utterly and completely incapable of actually doing that, what measures? How do we mitigate that, basically?
Well, I'll try and tease some of that apart a wee bit. On the one hand, I think what I was mainly focusing on is immigration policy in terms of policy that looks at the admission of migrants and the conditions of their stay, rather than integration policy. And this is an area of policy for which the Scottish Government currently, they have no competency on this. This is reserved. But what I find interesting is actually that Brexit, as well as other pressures, are pushing the Scottish Government into either wanting more power on this or more influence into the mechanisms through which it works. Because the goals that the Scottish Government is looking to pursue through who leaves and who goes and how they leave and go and what rights attach to them while they're doing this is something the Scottish Government is increasingly seeing a need to have an influence in, partly because of population, but also labour force and so on and so forth. And as you say, I mean, the other part is that, to some degree, I mean, this is just, I mean, this is the impact of Brexit. You know, we have, you know, we need to leave the European Union, and therefore European Union law will cease to apply, and therefore the legal status of all the EEA nationals living here will cease unless we make transitional arrangements. And so far, the government, the UK government and Home Office have not made the most practical decisions as to how they were going to make that a reality. So, I mean, it remains to be seen, but you're absolutely right. You know, it is not I mean, I can't remember. I think who was it? I think it was British Futures who put out a paper that at the rate of current processing, it would take them 20 years to process the existing EEA nationals applications, or something equally ridiculous. I mean, yes, I think, JCWI recently, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, came up with a statement of principles about the new immigration law that needs to come post-Brexit. And it was really interesting to see that, the top, and then they had 3 overarching principles, one of which was efficacy. We just want it to work. It just seems that, okay, so, we don't even need to talk about, should it, something more high value, but even the Joint Council of Immigrants are saying, well, can we just do something that's realistic, please?
I like the way you struggled with Brexit and you kind of paused and then came up with the term minefield. I mean, come on, people, Brexit means Brexit.
Simple.
What about other questions? Gentlemen, sorry, gentleman. Charles.
He's a gentleman.
Yeah, he's a gentleman.
Come
Gentleman and a scholar.
Thank you. Question for Emma. So your participants felt excluded in all sorts of ways, and you mentioned Scottishness in relation to a previous question. What about Glasgowness? Was there a more sort of local sense of belonging, sort of conviviality, as Gilroy talks about? It all seemed to be overwhelmingly about exclusion and negativity.
It's interesting. So somebody once said to me that if you're thinking about Glasgow as a city, you can't really think about Glasgow. You have to think about all the areas essentially as little villages that happen to be part of Glasgow. And I think amongst many of the people that I spoke with, it wasn't necessarily a sense of belonging to Glasgow, but coming from a particular area and the experiences within those areas. Again, identity is really complex. So I said that many people would associate with Britishness, but an awful lot of people have come through various different migration routes, many of whom have spent time in Europe. So an awful lot would say, no, I'm not really British, I'm European. Like, that's how I identify myself. So you get these kind of really broad identities, these really very local identities, and then kind of categories in between. So, and all of these kind of materialize and are mobilized at different times. So I can't really talk about them with any kind of concrete terms. But
messy and nuanced, I think,
yes,
is your phrase. Yeah. Hugo.
Hi, I'm Hugo from the Sociology Department here at Edinburgh, and I have a number of questions raised by both panels. But so Sarah, you and Nasa both had that slide suggesting that the majority of Scots want massively reduced immigration, but actually they see the contribution of migrants as a positive thing. So trying to think through that. And so a danger here, we end up with a differentiation between good or useful migrants and others, and then sort of differentiate between them. And if support for immigration is pragmatic rather than principled, then do we risk having second-class citizens who are here to plug gaps with no sense of belonging?
So, I mean, in relation to that second slide, I mean, I think what I understand that is showing, hang on a minute, is that you can want less immigration, but still see immigration as a good thing for Scotland. So that, in a way, you can think, yes, I know this is a good thing, it's just I don't really like it. And that shows you that actually these views are, once you start to unpack them a little bit, there's more scope for saying, okay, actually we need more immigration. On the second question, I think there's always the risk that you end up with good immigrants and bad immigrants. Once we called good immigrants refugees and bad immigrants economic migrants, now it's the other way around. These debates shift and change over time. I think what I see as interesting in terms of the Scottish Government's sort of approach to these things at the moment, as far as I see that emerging, is actually the desire, the population drive, which I think is quite an unusual one, means that actually there's a move there to make sure that the migrants that we are recruiting have got pathways to settlement. Now, across most OECD countries, pathways to settlement are being closed down. They're certainly being closed down for people in the lower skill brackets. So these are the people that essentially the approach of most sort of EU member states is get them in, make them work, chuck them out. And actually, I think there's an opportunity to do that differently in Scotland. I mean, we've also seen other countries start doing that differently. So for instance, Sweden, since 2008, their labour migration scheme doesn't have a skill specification. There's a minimum salary, but the minimum salary is quite low. And there's access to permanent settlement and social rights, actually, after a year, which is astonishing. Spain also. And again, in both countries, it's interesting that there is a conversation about ageing populations that links into that. So I wonder whether the population question will find itself solved by realizing that actually these sort of temporary circular routes are either unrealizable or not particularly beneficial. I mean, there's also all the disadvantages that you get from population churn. You know, that in a way, like if you want to run a reasonable integration strategy for newcomers of whatever description, it's rather difficult to do that to somebody who's leaving in 2 years anyway, because why should they be interested?
Begs interesting questions about political space as well, because it seems to me that certainly Westminster politics, there's almost no room for an acceptance that there may be positives through immigration. So, you know, there might be that public attitudes in Scotland that's a bit uncomfortable with it, but nevertheless is, you know, and that may be a success to some of the comments that NASA started.
I mean, you have, I mean, like this JCWI kind of question about let's just make it at least realistic, is this sense that, I mean, to some degree, some of the policies coming out at Westminster, I mean, the people implementing them know that they can't work. Yeah, we know that we can't enforce things like that. We know that's very unlikely. I mean, fine, we have moved the debate far further than we might have thought 10 years ago it would move. You know, but I mean, there's constantly this idea that, oh, we're going to solve this with, I think recently the one is digital processes. How are we going to do that? Oh, digital processes. And it's somehow this idea that, you know, technology is going to do some sort of magic wand thing where, I don't know, we can each scan a thumbprint and you'll know exactly what you're entitled to, as though these things are not complicated. Well, we know that they are.
Thumbprint on my phone doesn't work, so, you know. Opportunities for final questions? Okay, then I will ask you. Oh, was that? I beg your pardon.
Hi, this is for Lisa. Do you think that maybe if you had surveyed some Somalis in a more diverse city, or a differently diverse city, would there be a different perception of like belonging? So either I'm not quite sure about the proportion of ethnic minorities in Glasgow compared to Edinburgh or Aberdeen. But do you think if there were more or less others, would there be different results?
Okay, so in Scotland, Glasgow is the largest, or the Somali population in Glasgow is the largest in Scotland. That's largely due to the dispersal scheme, which was initially targeted primarily at Glasgow. So in terms of comparing Somali populations with other cities in Scotland, there aren't really any other Somali populations in Scotland at this time. There might be in very small numbers in Edinburgh, in Aberdeen, in Dundee, but none that kind of show up on any kind of data, and none that I've yet come across, although if anyone's listening, please let me know you're here. So in terms of a Scottish comparison, that's not really possible at the moment. In terms of a comparison with other populations in the rest of the UK, that's certainly possible, but conditions are very different. So, for instance, I might be able to compare Somali people's experiences in Glasgow with those in London or in Cardiff, where there are established populations. But these populations have been very long established, so since kind of late or 1800s onwards. So there's a whole different kind of background of community building, of second, third, fourth generation of people who are in those places. So it would be a very different experience. I mean, those are certainly discussions that kind of provoke interesting comparisons and start to talk about a Scottish context in terms of the Somali population. So yes, that's interesting. I can talk to you more about it later if you want.
begs other questions about comparisons. For example, current refugees, say from Syria, Isabella, in Glasgow. So, okay, we're going to draw it to a close there. A close? A pause? A close. Before we let Alistair finish off, can we just thank Emma and Sarah and Charlie and Ross and Nasser and Henna one last time.
Okay, my name is Alistair Hunter. I convene the Citizens, Nations and Migration Network, along with my co-convener Sophia Woodman, a sociologist, but she can't be here today, unfortunately. So I'm speaking for the both of us. Today's event was primarily organised by CNAM, as I'll refer to it from now on, although it's very generously funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Young Academy Scotland programme. So that's who I'm going to give my first fulsome vote of thanks to. Thanks also to ASEN Edinburgh's support, both in the form of Michael Rosie as chair, but also in publicising the event through their different platforms. If you'll allow me a brief digression before I continue with thanking more people, just to give you a little bit of background on CNAM. The network brings together over 150 researchers across the University of Edinburgh, but also additional people beyond the university, in other universities, but also in policy, in advocacy, and other NGOs. We're quite a new group. We've been going since the end of 2015. For the first 18 months, we've been focusing primarily on building up the network internally within the university, but latterly we've been able to reach beyond the confines of the academy, and this event is definitely proof that we're kind of beginning to succeed in that ambition. So thanks to all of the people who are kind of new, at least a new audience for us here today. We've had people from California, people standing up from Mauritius, Sweden, so it seems that we're getting the word out, so that's great. Thanks generally to all of you in the audience for making time to be there, to be at this event, especially this very busy time of year. And a special thanks to the organisations who joined us this morning prior to the lunch for our stakeholder forum. I really hope that this is just a beginning for our work together. More thanks. This is beginning to sound a bit like a kind of Oscars speech, but a lot of people really did help out with this event. It's not been your kind of typical standard research seminar. We have Gavin here, who's been working behind the scenes on the live stream. Also other people in the building in the techs in 50 George Square. The excellent caterers. I'm sure you all agree, much better than the standard fare you get here. I probably shouldn't say that on record. Okay. And finally, Helena Frostling-Matson, who is the events coordinator in the School of Social and Political Science, who was really helpful in kind of essentially telling me what not to forget for organising this. Last but not least, our speakers. I'm sure you'll all agree, a really fascinating lineup, really great range of talks, all of which were kind of individual in their insights and in their important nuances, but also speaking to this kind of central question, or at least apart from Charles's perhaps, the central question that is Scotland different on matters of race and migration. But I think even with Charles' paper, you're highlighting or foregrounding the English context to which is kind of implicit. It's the implicit other in our question here, and I think it's really important that we had that kind of voice from Portsmouth, this microcosm of England. I'd be interested actually to know, maybe Michael, you might be able to give some insight here. What would be the equivalent to Portsmouth in the Scottish context? Rosyth. Okay, well there you are. That's the final word on that. Yes, the answer, unsurprisingly from social scientists to our question, and as Ross highlighted, is yes, but. My view is that we really should be focusing more on that second word and not the yes, because I think all of the nuance and the important questions kind of are in the but, as it were. So I think that's kind of springboard for our own work in the network and more widely as well. So just a final round of thought. Thanks to our speakers to finish up. So thank you all.